Hello, y'all, to this week's podcast. Today's podcast is podcast week 4 for US Civics. Last week was, I think, just overall in this week of September is pretty eventful so far. I think one of the notable things is when the UN not walkout, which I'll talk later on. But let's get on with the first segments of the podcast. First, we have this article. With the article talking about Oregon sues over Trump admins, war ravaged Portland, National Guard troop deployment. So what does this mean? There's a lot of implications towards this, right? This seems to be like almost a second stage of his overall control over the government. As the Portland governor says in the article, he says Oregon communities are stable and our local officials have been clear. We have the capacity to manage public safety without federal interference, Raphael said in a statement. And so let me talk about the implication of this. One is this seems Trump pushing his power even more. So last week he censored Jimmy Kimmel about Charlie Kirk, right? On my opinion about it, I think your words should have consequences, of course. But the U.S. government going against him for that is kind of weird. Let it just be settled out for the public. These big companies going against it, of course, that's what cancel culture is for. But this seems to be almost Trump using his overall governmental position to do it rather than just the public. Segment 2. So this segment 2, we talked about, I'll use a Pew Research. It talked about the 1 in 5 Americans now regularly get news on TikTok, up sharply from 2020. Again, this goes on from my last week's podcast where we talked about TikTok. TikTok is huge right now inside the world, organized, just overall the world. Reason being is because TikTok has a lot of influence and is also not being censored as much as other social medias. For example, Instagram actually recently talked about how when they were under the Biden administration, they said that they were influenced by them to censor certain things about the COVID vaccine. Again, there's government interference in those type of things is really weird. Again, and that's why there's some arguments for how TikTok is being controlled by China. But then we talked about the US deal last week, talking about how the US government is getting both the data centers from it and also having over a 50% share into TikTok, and the other 50% goes to the adult company. So again, it's the TikTok overall, I think should stay, but I don't think it should be owned by the US government. I think the Chinese government also has their biases, of course, but as in the country I'm living in right now, the United States, I think it's a huge concern for them to own such a huge social media company. The largest growing, as this article perhaps says. So then you have, look at this. So in this one, you have the ages of which the percent of US adults who says they regularly get news on TikTok by age group. You can see that boomers from 50 to 65 typically don't really use it. I mean, you see an increase from 2020 to 2024 for all of these, of course, from all ages, but you don't see as much a percent rise compared to age 18 to 29, which is typically the Zoomers now, and then U.S. adults, which U.S. adults too have seen a rise too. So you see primarily teenagers use TikTok. Okay, this demographic has a lot of political power also, because these are the people who would go into the military for the U.S. government. So talking again from last week's podcast, we talked about how government control of TikTok would be kind of weird. Again, this is really the reason why. And you can see in this graph, you can see even a larger, steeper climb in the amount of people who regularly get their news from there. You see from Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and especially Twitter. But you see this dip though. You see this dip in age. You see this dip not in ages, but you see the dip. You see the dip in, what is that? Oh no, you see the dip in ages from 2021. Maybe that's just something against the overall data. But you can just see that as a notable thing to use. And then it talks about threads, who I don't know who uses threads at all, but yeah. And see, TikTok being the largest. Now let's talk about segment 3, Generation Z in the news. So in this Guardians, I use this one. This one happened last week. At least 4 dead and 8 injured in the shooting at a Mormon church in Michigan. I don't think this is being very widely talked about in popular media such as CNN or Fox News. I mean, it was briefly mentioned in Fox News last week when this happened, but it seems to is there's a lot of a general rise in what's it called, in school shootings. Not even school shootings. This happened in a church. Overall shootings again, and this happened in an LDS church. I think this again is should talk about. This should connect back. Okay, this connects back to Donald Trump. He talks about this epidemic of violence in a country must end immediately. Again, he doesn't talk about solutions. He just talked about it on his Twitter. Again, I think not even Twitter, True Social. Again, I don't think there's much validity for Donald Trump's things on Twitter or his True Social, because most of it is just him just going using the MAGA thing. Again, in North Carolina, another 40-year-old Marine who served on Iraq was the suspect in a shooting that killed 3 people that wounded 5 others less than 14 hours before the Michigan incident. This seems to be, it's really happening at the same time period. I don't know why September. I don't know why it's in the same days as each other, but it's just something to consider inside the argument. It's like, oh man, these are happening very often. We had the Charlie Kirk death what was called 14 days ago, and then you have the shooting, you have the stabbing of the white lady in the train to the Ukrainian woman. It's a lot of stuff happening at this time, and it's also happening at something that should be more talked about, and this leads on to the last part. I think, again, for the last few podcasts I've been talking about Israel mainly. I think Israel should be more talked about than what it is right now. Generally on the left you see or talk about Israel, and then on the right, by neoconservatives, you see more supportive of Israel. But I think they should really reconsider that thought. Reason being, this article: Netanyahu attacks Palestinians, recognition as dozens walk out of UN speech. Again, I think attacks Palestinians recognition. I think that it is what happened, but I think there's a better way. There's more specifics to that. What he talked about was what's called. Actually, let me talk about the actions that happened after this. After this UN convention, what's called, Netanyahu was still planning to annex the West Bank, even when Donald Trump says he won't even allow that. So this screams that Israel has so much control over the overall world that they can still do this while this happens. It shows the control that they have over these certain, even the ideas about them, because even though they walked out and they didn't want to hear it, right? He's still made the speech and still planning to do this at the same time. Also, the UN already recognized Palestine as a statehood now, as a recognition. By the way, something about that's happened so recently. It's super weird that it happened super recently. It has not been talked about as much, but also the implications of that haven't really affected the war in Gaza at all. I mean, you have the ships that are going to Gaza right now to feed the Palestinians, and then the Netanyahu was saying that this is a ship funded by Hamas. By the way, the ship has doctors, nurses, as well as priests and everything from multiple parts of Europe who supports Palestinians' recognition. Again, I think my main argument here is that Israel has so much control over the narrative as well as political overall power. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I'll see you next week. And I hope nothing bad happens this week. Maybe I just jinx myself right there. But I think my overall message for this specific podcast, is to, as again, read carefully into your resources, but also try to get as many events as you can happening in the world. You want to know what is happening in your world. I don't think being negligent of not knowing, it does not make it better. You are still it does just you be part of the problem because of it. Not being part of a problem as in you're doing it, but also not knowing. Like, for example, when the Holocaust happened, many people didn't know because of news, they were censoring it, right? But in today's age, you can see it. You can see what's happening in Gaza. You can see what's happening in the United States. And you can see what is happening in Oregon, too, in multiple articles. You can see it. So I wish people would really consider tuning in more. Even if you don't trust mainstream, you should still try to do journalists. You know what I mean? Even though journalists in Gaza do get, killed. Again. Thank you for listening for our podcast, and I'll see y'all next week. Thank you.